Today, we're going to talk about the terrible, horrible, insurmountable forms of Nor-Nori-Nork. If you're scared of this Basque grammar aspect, I hope watching this video will alleviate some of your fears. Hi, I'm Shanna, and this is Basque Berserk. Disclaimer, this is going to be a long video since we're going to go through all of the conjugations at the end. So this video might be a little tedious for those of you who already know this grammar. If you want, just watch this video on double speed, or you can skip the English grammar and go straight to the Basque. But for the sake of new and confused learners, I want to cover these grammar forms thoroughly. I'm sure you've seen this type of chart in your Basque studies. If you haven't yet, well, here it is. There's the Nor column, the Nor-Nori column, the Nor-Nork column, and the Nor-Nori-Nork column. This table, unless you have a Basque teacher on your shoulder explaining how to decipher these formulas, is quote-unquote mind-melting. So we'll focus on this last column, first row, present indicative synthetic Nor-Nori-Nork forms of Izan, which is just used as an auxiliary verb in multi-verb constructs, aka periphrastic verbs. Nor-Nori-Nork forms of the verb Izan are also known as dative transitive verb forms of Izan, or ukan if you're on the French side of the Basque Country or learning from a grammar book, or edun if you are into reconstructed verbs. I just call them dative transitive verb forms of Izan because it's a bit more precise, and for me it's easier to remember and distinguish. The transitive part of dative transitive Izan means that there is a subject and a direct object expressed by the verb. The dative part of dative transitive Izan means that there is an indirect object expressed by the verb or sentence or concept. Sometimes there are verbs that are more naturally used with this subject, direct object, indirect object idea. For example, the verb to give expresses a giver, a gift, and a receiver of the gift. The Basque equivalent of to give is eman, and this is the verb I'm going to give examples for. So let's review this grammar real quick in English, or skip ahead. The subject is the doer of the verb, or the person who acts. The direct object is who or what is directly affected by the subject. The indirect object is indirectly affected by what the subject does, and usually in English it's accompanied by prepositions like to or for. In the sentence, I gave water to the dog, I is the subject, since that is who is acting. Water is the direct object, since that is what is being acted on by the subject, and the dog is the indirect object, since it is not what is being affected by the verb directly, but rather it's like a third party that is involved in the action. Even if we rearrange to say, I gave the dog water, the subject, direct object, and indirect object designations stay the same, despite losing the word to and moving the dog to the middle of the sentence. The grammar per se stays the same. The same thing happens with I bought gifts for you, or I bought you gifts. I is the subject, gifts is the direct object, and you is the indirect object in both cases. So as you can see, there are three different components to this dative transitive concept, but in English the verb doesn't change to express this idea. In Basque, though, the verb does change to express each of these three components. So, in theory, there are 8 different persons for the subject, 8 different persons for the direct object, and 8 different persons for the indirect object. So you might be thinking, 8 times 8 times 8, that's like 512 different verb forms that I have to memorize? And that's only for one verb, and that's only in the present tense. What about the past tense? What about the conditional forms? What about the subjunctive forms? What about the potential forms? That's like
over 9,000!
Honestly, that's what Basques think too, and that's why most of these forms are never, ever, ever used in everyday situations. There's really no point in learning them unless you're doing some sort of doctorate thesis on the dative transitive conjugations of Izan. So let's start breaking down the scary conjugations of this verb form, and maybe you'll get a little more comfortable. Let me start by telling you 2 things you don't need to form this verb. Firstly, you don't need first or second person direct objects, which are the pronouns me, us, you, and you plural. You only use third person direct objects, which are him, her, and it in the singular, and them in the plural, or whatever other third person noun or nouns you are talking about. So you don't say things like, I am giving you to them, or they are bringing us to you, or you are recommending me to him. You, us, and me in these sentences are the direct objects, and they don't work in dative transitive verb forms. Well, they do work, again, theoretically, but we're not going to worry about those. I'll tell you more about how to get around this exclusion, but probably in a separate video. Basically, I am giving it to them, or they are bringing them to you, or you are recommending her to him. These third person, singular or plural direct objects are the only viable options. For singular third person pronouns or any other singular third person noun like dog, idea, man, you put the at the front of the verb. For the third person plural pronoun, they, and any other third person plural nouns like dogs, ideas, men, you put the ski at the front of the verb. Ski is something called a pluralizer, which signifies we are changing singular nouns into plural nouns. Okay, pretty simple so far. We've eliminated hundreds of forms in the whole paradigm by narrowing it down to only it and them as direct objects. The next thing we don't need in these forms are double persons. And what I mean by that is, you can't give something to yourself, at least not using the dative transitive verb system. Those are reflexive situations and not dealt with here. That's why you'll see all those gaps in the I, we, you, and you plural rows and columns, but not the it and them parts, since you can have different third persons acting and being acted on. I'm also not covering ica-forms, so we can take those away too. So now we have eliminated almost 90% of verb forms found in that original present tense chart. So we already have the and the ski for it and them as direct objects, which I've marked in purple, so somebody gives it or them to somebody else. The middle part of dative transitive Izan is the indirect object, which I've marked in blue, so to whom or for whom someone is acting. And we have 6 options to choose from. For first person singular, we have either T or DA, meaning to me, for me. T is used when there is not another suffix at the end of the form, which is only for a special circumstance, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Everything else is DA, meaning to me or for me. For third person singular, we have O, to him, her, or it, or for him, her, or it. For first person plural, we use GU, to us or for us. For second person singular, we use ZU, to you or for you. For second person plural, we use ZUE, to you plural or for you plural. For third person plural, we use E, to them or for them. So now our forms look something like this. Okay, so we're multiplying our options here. Now we can fill in the blank for someone who is giving, otherwise known as the subject, which I've marked in red. And this part comes at the end, quite the opposite of how it's done in English. For first person singular, we use T, just T, but the 2 preceding roles of direct object and indirect object will always be filled when the subject is first person singular I. And I want to stress this because the suffix for third person singular is nothing, no suffix whatsoever. When he or she or it is the subject giving something to someone, the visible last part of the form actually will be the indirect object. And this is the special circumstance I mentioned earlier when I said first person singular indirect object is either DA or T. Most of the time it's DA. But before this sort of invisible suffix that indicates he, she, or it as the subject, it's t. So in place of this invisible suffix, I use a dash, just so I can show it with color. So let's start over with the subject suffixes. First person singular, t, I give. Third person singular, null suffix, he, she, it gives. First person plural, gu, we give. Second person singular, zu, you give. Second person plural, zue, you plural, give. Third person plural, te, they give. So let's put them all together using the verb eman, creating a past tense. Eman diot, eman disut, eman disuet, eman diet. Eman dit, eman dio, eman digu, eman disu, eman disue, eman die. Eman diogu, eman disugu, eman disuegu, eman diegu. Eman didazu, eman diosu, eman digusu, eman diesu. Eman didazue, eman diosue, eman digusue, eman diezue. Eman didate, eman diote, eman digute, eman disute, eman disuete, eman diete. With that pluralizer ski, here are the forms. Eman diskiot, eman diskisut, eman diskisuet, eman diskiet. Eman diskit, eman diskio, eman diskigu, eman diskisu, eman diskisue, eman diskie. Eman diskiogu, eman diskisugu, eman diskisuegu, eman diskiegu. Eman diskidazu, eman diskiosu, eman diskigusu, eman diskiesu. Eman diskidazue, eman diskiosue, eman diskigusue, eman diskiezue. Eman dizkidate, eman dizkiote, eman dizkigute, eman dizkizute, eman dizkizuete, eman dizkiete. Okay, so there's definitely a lot more information out there about the usage or non-usage about dative transitive Izan, and I'll have another video with lots of examples to help you grasp this difficult concept. I think I'll say only one more thing for now. Remember, if you are explicitly including the noun or pronoun in the sentence that relates to the indirect object or the dative case, you must change its form in the sentence. This is absolutely mandatory, and you can learn more about how to do this in my dative case video. That's it! Thanks for watching! Agur!